The owner and 2 managers of a local sushi chain have been arrested, accused of hiring dozens of undocumented immigrants, keeping them in crammed houses and underpaying them. How investigators say it worked and why local police departments didn't stop it. That's on this edition of the Arizona's Family Investigates podcast.
Taking you behind the investigation. This is the Arizona's Family Investigates podcast.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the podcast. I'm Amy Cutler, joined by senior investigative producer Cody Lillick.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, there's a lot to this case that we've been following over the past week since we noticed this filing in federal court. It involves 4 area restaurants located across the valley. They are specifically sushi restaurants, and also 4 stash houses.
A neighbor surveillance camera captures agents preparing to raid a home in Tempe. According to court documents, the home near Elliott and Rural Road was considered a stash house where about 10 illegal immigrants stayed. Investigators say they were transported using white vans to and from Sakura Sushi Phoenix, where they worked every day, 7 days a week with no days off.
They had a white van and they would leave at 9 a.m. and come back at 9 p.m.-ish, right around dark, with a van full of guys. They'd all walk in like this, just looking down, no eye contact.
Brandy Foreman, who lives right next door to that home, knew something was off.
I was super uncomfortable with just the amount of guys and how nervous they looked.
They were very self-conscious. If you looked at them, they'd turn their back.
Gary Gallagher, who lives in Mesa near Southern and Gilbert Road, tells a similar story.
But you would never see them outside.
His home is across the street from another so-called stash house.
The person that was buying it looked like a Chinese man and woman, but when they moved in, they didn't.
According to the complaint, those housed here helped run the restaurant in Mesa.
In all, there were 4 restaurants and 4 stash houses, all of them raided by federal agents last week. Now, one of the owners and 2 of the restaurant's managers have been charged.
The complaint notes one of the owners, Young Lao, was born in China and has been a naturalized U.S. citizen for more than a decade. Agents going undercover at that Phoenix restaurant, noticing Chinese employees directed tasks and work of the employees of Hispanic ethnicity, and the Hispanic employees had limited interactions with customers.
It was pretty standard.
We had this former ICE agent review the complaint. He asked that we not share his name.
It is bigger than, your usual cases involving worksite enforcement.
It appears ICE began investigating back in March, but court documents show neighbors called Tempe police with concerns back in 2023 and 2024. Tempe police said their patrol squad attempted to gain intel, but were not able to establish any probable cause. Gilbert police were also alerted in May of last year. They told Arizona's Family Investigates what was reported was not criminal activity, and there was no mention of immigration. Neighbors of these houses, thankful action was taken.
I was thinking, finally, someone's doing something about this, because I definitely was concerned.
Lau is charged with harboring illegal aliens and knowingly employing unauthorized aliens. We reached out to attorneys for all 3 men, and they either declined to comment or didn't respond to our questions. Let's start with how this story came on our radar. And Cody, you found this one.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we stumbled upon this looking at federal court filings, and all of a sudden noticed these unique charges. Not something you see every day. We are used to seeing the immigration-related charges, especially after the ramped-up enforcement. But certain charges, those blend in and are the typical day-to-day in federal court. But these stuck out to us, and also looking at the nationalities of those arrested, that also stuck out to us, because you do have on some of the normal border-related arrests, you do have some that are from other continents, from other countries other than Mexico and some Central American countries. So that also stuck out to us, and actually caught our eye that there were a string of these arrests, and some of them had the same last name. So that popped out at first to us. And then once, of course, I opened the criminal complaint, which is basically the preliminary process in all of this, and just the first stage that basically establishes why these people were arrested. Once I opened up that first complaint and read the significance of this case, it had definitely dated back several months. And this wasn't just a typical immigration enforcement arrest or someone crossing the border or just one of the regular arrests that have been made by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This was something that they had been working on for several months. And in fact, they said it dates back to the ramped up enforcement that they started in February. And their cases specifically, especially this one, looking at how if any illegal immigrants are being employed at businesses in the Phoenix area and what their statuses were. And that's exactly what they found in this case, is that this restaurant was, the 4 locations were employing not only their regular employees, but also this other tier of employees that were basically illegal workers working for their restaurants, and they were being housed and essentially crammed into houses. Basically, it represented one for each restaurant, essentially. And they were being held in these houses, forced to work every day of the week and long hours, and essentially cheap labor.
It was sort of interesting, too, because in stopping by some of these businesses and homes, you would expect with, federal agents raiding each of these places, we were saying we would have expected that neighbors would have called into the news station to say, hey, there's this event going on, you might want to check this out. And it's just sort of interesting, given what we've seen now with some of these ICE raids, that didn't happen.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that we went and did first. It was looked and saw when, all of these arrests were coordinated on the same day at all of these locations hitting at once. So that way, agents don't have one member of these houses or this family tipping off another house, and you kind of, that way the element of surprise is there. That's how these all went down at 9 a.m., I believe, on December 10th. So looked back in our archives and in our tip system, was there anything that unusual that people saw that may have emailed or called into the station? Nothing obvious, especially we have had people call in and email in at times when there are these sudden, raids or arrests happening with ICE and Homeland Security Investigations, which is the criminal arm of ICE. But in this case, we didn't have any tips, no phone calls, no emails. So this one really did happen out of the blue. And the first time we noticed it was when this federal court filing was entered, and we had noticed it there. There wasn't even a press release issued about it. It wasn't even, there is also a press release by the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Arizona that basically runs through the 100 to 200 immigration-related cases that they say are related to the increased enforcement that we've been seeing over the past year under the new administration, and it was not in their roundup of arrests that happened that week either. So it really was out of the blue and would have went unnoticed if it wasn't for checking the federal court system.
Now, we actually went to those homes and businesses, and we're going to have more on what we found there coming up next.
So we're taking you behind this investigation into this chain of sushi restaurants here in the Valley that were accused of hiring illegal workers. These were people from Mexico and Central America hired to work at these sushi restaurants. And also kept in what are essentially stash houses, crammed people, several people to a room, and forced to work long hours. And we know that these restaurants are now closed. One of the owners and 2 of the managers accused of using these undocumented immigrants to run this place. And let's start with the restaurants themselves. Amy, you went by 3 out of the 4, the ones in Phoenix, Mesa, and Gilbert. What did neighboring businesses seem to know about what went on?
It was interesting because it seemed like most of the neighboring businesses knew something was off here. They saw these white vans that were pulling behind the buildings, never parked out front. They saw some of these workers, again, coming out, heads down, avoiding eye contact. And so, some of these businesses on either side said, hey, we knew that something was amiss here. They suspected that there were possible undocumented immigrants, but they didn't know for sure. But they knew, seeing the white vans, that something was off. And it's sort of interesting because from the business perspective, none of these neighboring businesses called police about this. But they had their suspicions and they weren't surprised. But they also talked about when the federal agents moved in for these raids, and they talked about just what a huge show of force it was. Dozens and dozens of these federal agents coming in, kicking in the doors in some situations, using crowbars. It was quite a show of force when they moved into these restaurants. And they talked about how they brought out a substantial amount of boxes of different items and things. You have to imagine that it's part of an ongoing investigation, so they've got to gather whatever evidence they can. But this was not something that they were trying to do discreetly. This was clearly a show of force at these businesses.
And you talk about those white vans. It's worth noting, again, you touched on it in the story, but these white vans it was a systematic kind of operation where they would show up at 9 a.m., pick up the people from the houses, go to the sushi restaurants, drop them off in the back in the employee entrance, basically. And also on the flip side, whenever they closed the restaurant, it would be in reverse. The white vans would show up, pick up the employees out of the back employee entrance, and then they would show up at the stash house. And then, we saw reports of people in those neighborhoods seeing several people, exit out of the back of a van, which is really unusual. You mentioned that the neighboring businesses kind of had a hunch. Why didn't they call police?
So I think that there was sort of a sense that it didn't seem like these people were being, there was no violence at hand. They didn't feel like they were necessarily fearful for their safety or something. So they felt like sort of mind their own business. And then, when it came to these federal agents in the raid, I sort of asked, hey, did you guys get any video? We want to see sort of what happened. And they were like, there was such a show of force, and there was so, there's a sense of sort of, the show of force. They were kind of scared. We've seen some other situations across the country with, federal agents moving in. And so there was certainly some concern there. So people sort of kept their distance from that. But it was interesting because in the neighborhoods, there was a different sense. Speaking to neighbors, they felt like something wrong was happening here. And they did call Tempe police and Gilbert police. The fact that there would be people filing out of homes at specific hours at day and night, they knew something was wrong there. They called. But these businesses felt like they sort of needed to keep their business, their space, I guess I could say.
Yeah, we'll get to more of the neighborhoods and what those neighbors saw in just a second. But federal agents, we mentioned that this was not a spur of the moment case of, they saw something suspicious happening and just moved in. This is something that they had built up for several months and even surveilled some of these locations. What did you note as far as their investigation in building up this case?
They really spent quite a bit of time in these locations trying to get a sense of what was going on. And so in that criminal complaint, we saw investigators sort of note that there was a two-tiered system where these Chinese people who were appearing to work the front interacted with customers, and those that appeared to be of Hispanic ethnicity, that's a quote from the criminal complaint, sort of kept their distance, avoided eye contact, didn't appear to speak English. And so it sort of created this dichotomy in that working situation of, who the front people were and sort of who those back people were.
Yeah, I have that section of the criminal complaint here, and I'll read a little bit of it, talking about the agent, I believe it was with Homeland Security Investigations, observed that communication and directives between the employees appeared to be one way, with the Chinese employees directing tasks and work of the employees of Hispanic ethnicity. The employees of Hispanic ethnicity had limited interactions with the patrons and did not appear to speak English. And I will say that the agent who wrote this criminal complaint actually was there as a customer and was at a table, and it says a young Hispanic female employee arrived to bus the table. She avoided eye contact and did not engage, and when asked a question, she did not provide any response. One of the Chinese employees instead answered the question from the agent. So that just one of the examples of this, essentially what the agent has described as a two-tiered system of these, as they're described, Chinese employees essentially being the servers and also the sushi bar employees and that kind of thing, and the Hispanic employees being the lower level of employees as it's described in these documents, and kind of as this one example said, was bussing the table. But no acknowledgement, I think it was just, a pleasantry, as small talk basically, and the Hispanic female didn't even engage in that.
And it's interesting because it's unclear from reading the criminal complaint if this was something that was enforced, that these folks were told not to speak, to avoid eye contact, if there was any kind of force possible there, or if it was just that they felt sort of uncomfortable. They knew their immigration status, and so they didn't want to make any waves.
It could also be a language barrier. It did say that they did not speak English, so that might be why they didn't engage as well. So that is definitely, there could be a variety of reasons, but that is something that the agent said struck them and what they took note of in their interactions in one of these restaurants. So we also talked about how you went by 3 of these stash houses, as they were called, where these migrant illegal workers are brought across the border and housed in these locations, multiple people to a room, and forced to work long hours. What are these neighborhoods like? What did you see when you went out there?
These are really remarkably quiet neighborhoods. We were there middle of the day. There was, sort of set back from the main roads, really quiet. Nothing was going on. The homes sort of where these stash houses were sort of fit in with the rest of the community. They didn't stand out really in any way. And so that was part of the purpose. They didn't want to stand out. But when you spoke to neighbors, they knew exactly what was going on in those houses. At least they suspected that there was something going on, because you have to keep in mind that there were these white vans coming, leaving from the home at around 9 a.m. in the morning, coming back around 9:30 at night. They would be parked in the driveway. You had these guys going out of the vans through the back right to the house. And some of these neighbors said that they would wave, to be friendly. They avoided eye contact, looked down, tried to avoid any kind of conversation. And so the blinds for all the windows were drawn. They said that they never saw these people coming out of the house, even on really nice weather days. So it was suspicious to a lot of these neighbors. They believed that there was something amiss here.
And they actually took action to call police. Something was so suspicious that they decided to pick up the phone and give a call.
They did. So Tempe police confirmed that they had received 2 calls, one from 2023, I believe the other from 2024, from neighbors. They said that they drove by the house. They wanted to check things out, but there just wasn't anything for them to really go on. And we should point out that it's not really up to local police departments to do immigration enforcement. So if there wasn't any kind of suspicious activity that they could note, they felt like it wasn't in their purview to move forward. Gilbert police also received a report back in 2024. And they, in this situation, the public information person actually told me that they reviewed the body camera video of what exactly happened, and that person also did a drive-by. They didn't see anything at the home, which you wouldn't expect them to, because these guys were probably, if it was in the middle of the day, these guys were gone. They were at work because they were working 6 or 7 days a week. So, that they did their due diligence of kind of driving by. And Gilbert police was quick to point out that their complaint did not mention anything involving immigration. So they said that they had no reason to believe that these were so-called stash houses, that they, did their due diligence in investigating what they thought was suspicious activity. And they said that the caller wasn't very specific on what that actually was.
Yeah, I want to read a little bit from what Gilbert Police provided to Arizona's Family Investigates. They say what was reported to our officers at this time was not criminal activity, and the reporting party also made no mention of immigration. When the officer investigated this citizen's general concern, nothing suspicious was located. Ultimately, matters of immigration violations are enforced federally by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and that's what we're seeing in this case is the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, specifically what's called Homeland Security Investigations, which is the criminal enforcement arm of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That is essentially what we're seeing is this case being built up by them. And we know about these calls because the HSI agents actually detailed them after knowing about these houses. They go back and, see, okay, local law enforcement, were they ever called about this, and that's how we keyed in on this. And you mentioned Tempe. They had the 2 reports, and their response to Arizona's Family Investigates was on October 16th, 2023, an officer took a telephone report from a neighbor who was reporting suspicious activity they believed to be consistent with human trafficking. So very interesting. They note that in their statement. They say, based on the information provided in the report, a report was not taken, but it was documented under a street check. And that's what we have essentially noticed is, someone calls and says, hey, I noticed something strange. And, if it's some people loading up in a van, by the time the police officer gets over there, it's probably gone. So then it is a cleared call. The statement does go on to say that the information was passed along to the officer's patrol sergeant, and it talks about another telephone report that was made in March of 2024, but the call was canceled because the original caller did not answer when an officer called back to take the phone report. The patrol squad that received the information attempted to gain intel, they tell us, but they were not able to establish any probable cause.
And it's important to note here, it's not like there was some kind of noise violations that were going on or there was something, that stood out about the house. I mean, these were houses that were kept up. They paid all their utility bills. The houses were owned, outright. So there wasn't really much for police to act on. It was just these white vans that were at the house in the morning and there in the evening.
And it's kind of a thing to where, the police are, doing their routine public safety patrols. And unless they are there in that moment, they may not see anything because by the time somebody calls and the officer gets over there, they're probably long gone or, as we know now, at the restaurant dropping people off or vice versa. So it could have been, right place, right time for them to get away and not be seen or only seen by the neighbors and not the police officer that responds. So what's next for the case of these 3 men who have been charged, and what happened when we stopped by the owner's home? That's next.
And we're back, going in depth on a local sushi chain accused of using undocumented immigrants, having them stay in crammed living conditions, and then using white vans to transport them to and from work. Let's talk about the 3 men charged. Young Lau is the owner of 3 of those restaurants and 3 of those stash houses.
Yeah, he's one of them. I guess you would describe him as a main player in all of this. He's charged with harboring illegal aliens and a pattern and practice of knowingly employing unauthorized aliens. Those are the exact federal charges as it's laid out in the court documents. It says that he was born in China and became a naturalized U.S. citizen in May of 2011. He opened that first sushi restaurant, the Phoenix location, in August of 2017.
So he owned that restaurant for a long time, which was sort of surprising to me.
These were established businesses, and after this story ran, we actually got a text message from our news director, who said, this story is taking off on Nextdoor. People had posted our story on Nextdoor, basically saying, do not. They were discouraging people from going to these places, but we know now that they are closed. And I had done a little more research after that and looked up, and people had seen, closed for the foreseeable future, or just mentioning that they are closed. Sorry for the inconvenience. So people were wondering why they were closed, and I don't think a lot of the patrons thought this was happening.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's unclear how long they were using these undocumented immigrants. Young Lau is the owner or part owner of all 4 restaurants and owns 3 of the 4 stash houses. He's also listed as a person who pays the utilities for all 4 homes. Now, in an interview with investigators, he stated he hired unauthorized aliens because, quote, it was hard to find workers to do the jobs he needed. He admitted that he knew what he was doing was wrong, but that he was providing housing as a benefit to the workers. So it's sort of an interesting admission here, reading that what he knew he was doing was wrong. And you sort of wonder that explanation that he couldn't find people to work in the restaurants who were in the country legally.
Well, and it goes to that 2-tiered system again of all of these Hispanic workers were paid off the books. They were paid in cash, not through official employment records. So when the agents went to go check through the Department of Economic Security, which has, employment records of taxes and everything, for employers, that they were not in the system as being employees of these businesses. So, they were not being properly taxed, basically the normal process wasn't happening here. And so this was theoretically an economic advantage for these businesses to not have to pay the taxes for these workers and not have to go through the actual payroll process that would, take a cut out for state services or the federal government. And these people were just being paid, as it's called, under the table and just in cash and off the books. So that goes to exactly what agents saw as this 2-tiered system. And, he admitted that it was wrong and provided this housing as a benefit. But while that may sound nice, they were not getting paid as well as other workers. And he went on to describe to investigators how he had at least one Chinese worker living at these stash houses, and he described them as a, quote, caretaker to monitor the Mexican unauthorized aliens, end quote. And Amy, you stopped by one of these, his home in Chandler, and tell us about that.
Yeah, it was sort of interesting because we wanted to see if young Lau would have a response to what was going on. And so we stopped by. It was a gated community in Chandler. It was relatively new. All the houses appeared to be, in great condition. Neighbors say that the couple who lived there mostly kept to themselves, but they described them as friendly, kind people. They had seen those federal agents raid the home because their home was raided along with the restaurants and stash houses. And so there were sort of some rumors speculating what they were there for because no one knew. And so they were thinking that maybe there was something. They had recently built a shed in the back. So there was some sort of speculation about what was being kept in the shed or what was going on. None of them realized that they had owned these 4 sushi restaurants and that they were employing these undocumented immigrants. So it was sort of an interesting situation. And they were talking about how they had seen all of this, that the federal agents had their blocked off for a full day as they were coming and going from this home, but they didn't have a sense of what was behind that.
So when you go up there, you try to talk to them for comment, try to talk to young Lau for comment. You knocked on the door. What happened?
Yeah, so I knock on the door and I get what sounds to be a child who answers the door. So I try to just mention that I'm a reporter from Arizona's Family, and I'm just trying to follow up. I didn't want to mention that, this was a raid on the home or what the specifics were. So it sounded like a child. They opened the back door, but they had that screen door, so I couldn't see in. And then as I'm talking to them, it appeared, someone else came up and they just said, "Put your card on the mailbox," and then quickly slammed the door. So I didn't get very far in having a sense of things, but I understand from neighbors that it was, a couple, and then they have some kids. So these younger people might have been the couple's grandchildren.
Gotcha. And you haven't heard back?
No, not from them. And then we also reached out, we should importantly note, to the attorneys for all three. And they have either declined to comment or haven't responded to our questions.
We should also note that we mentioned there were three basically key players in all of this. One of these people was Young Lau's brother, that would being Quinn Liu. He's charged with harboring illegal aliens. So, and what was your reaction to reading that and knowing that, this is two brothers?
It was interesting in the court documents, he waives his Miranda rights and he speaks pretty freely, it seems, about how much he was paid, when he was paid, how it all worked. So it'll be interesting to see how that information is used moving forward.
Yeah, actually, Liu told investigators he was paid $5,000 a month by check. Meanwhile, the undocumented workers were paid much less. They told investigators they made around $1,500, and that being in cash every 2 weeks.
Yeah, and we have to keep in mind, while that sounds like decent money, when you think about the number of hours they were working 12, 13-hour days, 6, 7-day weeks, and they were not making overtime. You also wonder, if they couldn't go to work, they weren't feeling well, what happened then? There's not any kind of accountability here because they're here, undocumented and they don't have the same rights that they would if they were here legally.
Right. And one interesting note about this entire case, we've heard a lot about rapid deportations happening, especially under the new administration. But in this case, some of these illegal workers and, as the court system describes them, illegal aliens who were at these houses are actually being held. They are not being rapidly deported back to Mexico or Central America. They're being called material witnesses in this case and held in U.S. custody so that they can testify against the people who once employed them. These illegal workers, along with their former bosses, are now slated to be in court again in late December. But it's interesting, this now visual of, they were employed and housed in these stash houses, and now the tables have turned and they are essentially going to be material witnesses in the case against their bosses.
And in speaking to a former ICE agent, they were pointing out that HSI, who's behind this investigation, they've been there, but they haven't done this kind of enforcement. We know under the new administration since March, there has been a push to do more of this kind of work. And so the ICE agent was saying that this is pretty standard operating procedure for HSI. It's just they haven't done these types of cases in the last few years, at least the scale and the frequency that we're seeing now.
And they did note to start off the criminal complaint that, since I believe the date was February 2025, that they have specifically been ramping up enforcement and looking at these type of cases. So it may not be the last that we see of a case like this, especially if they find more evidence of this around Arizona.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see if there are any more arrests in connection with the case. We know that this is an ongoing investigation, but we will continue to follow developments here closely. Thanks for joining us for this edition of the Arizona's Family Investigates podcast.
The Arizona's Family Investigates podcast, hosted by Amy Cutler and produced by Cody Lillick, and a production of Arizona's Family 3 TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.